be here. Let me introduce my wife, Mary Jane. We've been married for 36 years, and she put up with me for that. And actually, we've been married almost 41 years. She was a teacher for 36 years. But as she knows, even clear back to when I was a county commissioner back in the 90s, that the open meetings, open record was extremely important to me. And very proud to say that I won the Sunshine Award in 2016. And when you look at Oklahoma, Oklahoma currently receives an F when it comes to openness in government. And we're very proud of the fact that in the auditor's office, where I'm the state auditor, we received a B, which just said we were the shining light of Oklahoma as far as transparency. And the reason we didn't receive an A is because we can't initiate audits like we feel like we should be, and they feel like we should be. And we don't have the resources to do all the audits we need to do. And so that being said, I think it's extremely important that the people are able to see what goes on in their government. Just so happens that 31 of the state's legislatures are subject to the Open Meetings and Open Records Act. There's only 7 that are not. Oklahoma is one of those. One of the things I want to do as governor is make the legislature open to the public. And the other ones that they're either subject to the open meetings or open records. But we're rated extremely low in openness in government, and it doesn't have to be that way. You know, it's our tax dollars that are being spent. We should know what goes on, and I'll do everything in my power to make sure that we do the things necessary to open up government. Right now, when you look at the problems in the state of Oklahoma, we've got some tremendous financial problems, and that I'm uniquely qualified to address those issues, and the fact that I know how we got here, I know what mistakes have been made, and I know what it's going to take to fix those mistakes. And that being said, with my background as not just a county commissioner, but a state auditor, I'm also a certified public accountant. And whether your main issue is education, whether it's corrections, healthcare, it all boils back to the budget, and I feel like I'm uniquely qualified to solve those problems. And that's why I'm running today, because it's all about my kids' and grandkids' future, and that's extremely important to me. So thank you.
Our next opening statement is from Chris Powell.
My name is Chris Powell. I'm a Libertarian candidate for governor, and I'm going to tell you, do something that politicians often do, is they talk about something in their personal lives that in many ways is unrelated to what's going on. My hobby is genealogy, but I bring that up because it does pertain. I use public records all the time when I'm doing genealogy research in lots of different formats: probate, land records, court records, all kinds of things like that. So open records are very important to me. That's not necessarily the same as a reporter trying to get emails from the governor's office, but it is related. And in fact, in 2011, the State Department of Health made a change in their policy to make death certificates, all death certificates in this state, to no longer be public record as they had been since statehood. I worked with my state senator, now Oklahoma City Mayor David Holt, and Representative Elise Ball to push legislation to change that, and we got that rolled back a little bit so that the public does have access to some of those records that would otherwise be completely out of reach to the general public. So again, open records are very important to me. In fact, I believe I'm the only candidate that is currently listed as having signed the Freedom of Oklahoma pledge to open government and transparency in government that's up here tonight, and I'm very proud of that. In 2016, when I ran for Oklahoma County Clerk and got 89,000 votes in Oklahoma County, I was also a signer at that time, and I would encourage all of the other candidates up here to also sign the FOI Oklahoma Pledge to adhere to the spirit and letter of the law as far as open records and to promote transparency in government. And thank you all for being here. Thank you.
Up next is Drew Edmondson.
Thank you. I had a little trouble seeing over there, so I'm going to start my own time clock. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. By background, my name is Drew Edmondson. I grew up in Muskogee, Oklahoma. I served as the district attorney over there for 10 years. I ran for attorney general and served in that capacity for 16 years. During the entire time that I was attorney general, I served on the board of FOI Inc. and was proud of that service and proud of the work that this organization does. And by the way, Chris, I signed that pledge, and if you all don't have a record of that, I'm going to sue. But one of the things that ought to be noted, that since the Open Meetings Act passed in the 70s, signed into law by David Boren, and the Open Records Act, which became law in the mid-'80s, the Attorney General has typically been the champion of both of those statutes. Most of the cases that you'll find, particularly under the Open Meeting Act, are Attorney General opinions rather than cases of different courts. And in Oklahoma, the opinion of the Attorney General is the law unless and until it's overturned by a court of competent jurisdiction. And that's an Attorney General opinion with a capital O. Now, my ordinary day-to-day opinions are usually matters of idle curiosity, particularly to my wife Linda, who is here, but they don't have the force of law, and anybody who knows Linda knows that that's true. I enjoyed working in this arena during the time that I was Attorney General. Some of the opinions that we issued included the inclusion of cell phones and private computers as places where people can go for open records. The law says that if it's a record and if it pertains to the conduct of business or the expenditure of public funds, it's an open record, subject to the Open Records Act, unless it's made confidential by some other provision of law. The Act makes no reference to where those records are located. So if those records are on your personal cell phone in the form of email messages or whatever, if they meet the other qualifications, our AG opinion said those are open records. We believe, and the statement of purpose of both of those acts talk about an informed citizenry's right to know. And we believed in the AG's office that any time there was a gray area, you erred on the side of the public's right to know. Their right to the access of records, their right to the attendance in open meetings, their right to know what their government was doing. That will be my attitude as governor. Thank you.
The next opening statement is from Libertarian candidate Rex Lawhorn.
Hi everyone, my name is Rex Lawhorn. I'm from Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. I am a paint store manager on the north side of Tulsa. I just got off work this afternoon to drive down here to speak to you all this evening. I don't have any background in working in government service, but I have a ton of experience trying to work with and through government to get things done that needed to take place at my home, at my property, with my family, etc. And I think anybody sitting in this room tonight that has ever tried to work with the government to get anything done, so much as getting a building permit on your property, knows that it's extremely difficult. There are a lot of issues that Oklahoma is facing today. Most of those are due to the fact that the government is not open currently. Sure, we've got a lot of things on record, but one of the more recent events that strikes me is the release of the Tar Creek document, which the Attorney General's office was doing their very best to keep hidden until someone from out of state came and sued. That was an audit that they had a hard time getting done in the first place because the Attorney General's office wouldn't approve it. And it's like Mr. Jones was saying, that somebody has to ask him before he is allowed to audit a place that he already knows is a problem. And that's not just been his problem, that's been the problem of every state auditor before him. And that is precisely because our government has extremely tight restrictions on what information can be done and what each agency is allowed to do, what information can be released. The Freedom of Information Act and the Open Meetings Act are something that Oklahoma absolutely has to have in place. And I will work with the legislator as governor to make sure that it becomes law in the state of Oklahoma also, and that we are not embarrassingly one of the 7 states that don't have that policy. Another thing I would do as governor is I would steal something from former governor of New Mexico, Gary Johnson, and institute Open Office Fridays. Right now, it is very difficult to get any time with the governor of the state of Oklahoma, but what I am intending to do is allocate at least 1 Friday a month. If that fills up, we'll move to 2 Fridays a month, where any citizen of the state of Oklahoma can request a meeting with me to come sit in the office and discuss whatever issues you have with the state government, whether I can do anything about it or not. Even if I can't, I would know the right avenue to go to have something taken care of. And I can promise each and every person that comes to visit me in the office that they will get a personal response from me indicating exactly what actions I took. the problems that we have in the state of Oklahoma are specifically because the people are not informed. The electorate is not informed, and that goes through every aspect of what we have in the state government right now. And it's specifically because they want to keep those things quiet so that they can maintain their power. Thank you.
The next opening statement is from Republican Blake Stevens.
Yes, thank you for coming today. My name is Blake Cowboy Stevens. I'm from Tahlequah, Oklahoma. I work at Locust Grove Schools as a school counselor for 21 years. I'd like to start it a little differently. I'm not a public speaker, by the way, but thank you for having me. And I just ask you in the audience and those at home that are viewing this, if you would ask whoever your higher power is to be with us in Oklahoma while we go through this process, because we need that help. And so, in saying that, I'm telling you that I'm here as an individual, just like you sitting out there. I'm a real man. I'm a real cowboy. And the time has come for change. And I don't know exactly what all we're in for. I can tell you that everything's upside down. And yes, transparency has got to be there. We have to be transparent. See, I'm an honest man. My words matter. And so I'm a man of my word. I protect my words because every word that comes out of my mouth, I'm responsible for. So as your leader, if that's what is intended through this process, then I will know that I will be representing each and every one of you, no matter what walk of life, no matter your color, no matter your gender. This is not a speech that I've written. This is a speech that comes from my heart. That's who I am. I'm a cowboy with a big heart. So you may be seeing me for the first time. I've got some videos on Facebook. You can learn more about me there. I have a real heart for Oklahoma. I have a real heart for our country. I have a real heart for our world. I have never, ever talked about running for office. This came about in a conviction on the last day to file for governor. And I had many people at the Capitol when I was there 9 days on the walkout with teachers trying to get more funding for our students and our families that deserve it. So we need to put education number one. We're talking about government. We're talking about real change. We've got to come back and completely rebuild what we've got going on. See, we're dead bottom I'm sorry, got distracted. We're dead last in everything that we want to be first in. And we're first in everything we want to be last in. So we got a lot of work to do. And see, I've got rolled up sleeves. I'm ready to go to work. I'm a hard worker. I've got a farm and a ranch. And I am ready to go to work for you and fix Oklahoma. Thank you.
We're asking each candidate to give their thoughts on the First Amendment and open government and how each would play a part in their administration if elected. And the next opening statement is from Republican candidate Dan Fisher.
Well, hello, my name is Dan Fisher. Thank you for being here. Thanks for having me, guys. It is a privilege to be a part of this. Been married to my wife, Pam, now for 37 years. We have 2 adult children, 4 grandchildren. I was a public school teacher. My wife taught longer than I did. I've been in the full-time ministry since I was 24. 2012, I ran for and was elected to the Oklahoma House of Representatives. So I've been behind the closed-door meetings. I've been behind the veil. And I know why government doesn't want to be transparent. I've watched firsthand what goes on, and I'm telling you, you wouldn't like it. Now, why in the world would a government not want you to know what they're doing? There's only one way that I can imagine that a government would not want you to know, because what they're doing is wrong, right? Now, we all know that because of the fallenness of man, government has a tendency to overuse its power and to become corrupt. This is why the founders ensconced in the first 10 amendments what we call the Bill of Rights, because that government and the Constitution, when it was first put out for ratification, only gave what the government could do. It didn't tell the people what it couldn't do. So the Bill of Rights harnesses the government. The First Amendment is one of those key amendments because it guarantees freedom of a lot of things: speech, religion, press, the ability to petition your government, to gather together. So, in being in the House of Representatives, I understand uniquely what needs to happen in government to clean this thing up. We need to make government completely transparent. I worked with Representative Jason Murphy when I was there in a number of committees, trying to modernize and bring our government up to at least the 20th century. We tried very, very hard to make government more and more transparent, and yet, of course, they fight every step of the way. So what we need is a government that is constitutional, therefore honest, and the only way that we can guarantee that is if a government is held accountable, and the only way to do that is through transparency. I tell people all the time out here campaigning that if they saw what goes on in the House of Representatives or the Senate, they would be infuriated. Bills being taken away from authors and given to someone else as a favor, representatives and senators being punished because they didn't go along with what the leadership said. So I am all about transparency. If I'm elected governor, I'll guarantee you this government will be open.
And the next opening statement is from Libertarian candidate Joe Exotic.
Good evening, thanks for having me here. I'd like to introduce my wife, but my husband's at home feeding my brand new baby kangaroo. I always wanted to say that. I've been in Oklahoma for a little over 20 years now. I graduated high school in Texas at the age of 19 as the youngest police chief in the state of history in the state of Texas. Been awarded awards by the United States Postal Service. I ran for President of the United States against Donald Trump. I made 37 ballot accesses on a $10,000 budget. I know how to work from the ground up and get something done. First thing about the First Amendment, okay? We're going to see how far freedom of speech gets me kicked out of here tonight. You are guaranteed something by we the people. It's not by them the people up there at the Capitol, okay? That's the first mistake that we had. Us, as legitimate people running for governor, can't even get them to answer our phone calls, let alone you get an answer out of one of them. You have to fill out a Freedom of Information request, and if you hear something back, you're lucky. Okay? The first thing we got to do is completely open it up. Okay? You, the people, should have the answers at your hands anytime you want about anything. The governor's office to the senator's office to the House of Representatives office should be open Monday through Friday from 9 to 5 for anybody. You shouldn't have to fill out a form and get a form email back that says thank you for your question, here's your answer, goodbye. Okay, the only time that they want to talk to you is right now when they're shaking your hand hoping that you'll vote for you, and then after that you're just another citizen again because they've got their pot of gold with the lobbyists and everybody else that's at the bottom of that. So there is no accountability up there at that big house. And it's time to get the working people out there in real Oklahoma. Get some of us up there in office so we can start this all back again from the ground up. I've been at every one of the forums except the one that we put on during this race right now, and all you hear is corporate American blue-collar jobs. I don't know how many of you are from out there in the rural part of Oklahoma can't find any help. Everybody's got meth addiction problems and everything else. We got to start this from the ground up and fix Oklahoma again before we worry about giving tax breaks and tax incentives and move everybody in here that can just fill up the jobs and then go bankrupt 2 years later and we're back to square one again. We have got to fix Oklahoma. And I'm kind of like Cowboy Bob over here. If we have to haul scrap iron to do it, by God, we're going to do it. But we're going to do it for you, the people, this time instead of them, the people.
The next opening statement is from Republican candidate Christopher Barnett.
My name is Christopher Barnett, and my husband here is with us, Trey Barnett, in the audience. Thank you so much for allowing me to come this evening. I'm an activist for free speech and government transparency. 4 years ago, I sent an open records request to Tulsa Community College, and the response I got was that I had to pay them thousands of dollars for my open records request. And in fact, it went all the way up to $121,000. I ended up filing suit against the Tulsa Community College, and that suit is still ongoing right now. When I went to that hearing back in January this year, I was detained by sheriff's deputies because the University of Tulsa and the law firm of Powell Steele called in a false threat. And they were trying to intimidate me and stop me from pursuing my open records request, and they failed. The next day I filed suit against the University of Tulsa and Powell Steele, and not surprisingly, 30 days later, they went and filed an emergency motion in federal court seeking to silence me and take away my First Amendment rights. The court ruled in my favor and found that they were trying to disguise a gag order or put a gag order in place, and they ruled for me. If I'm elected, I want to make sure that government transparency is just that, transparent. We have so many loopholes in the Open Records Act right now. I have heard everything from excessive disruption to it's confidential to it's personal in nature. And under the Open Records Act, we don't have a personal in nature exemption. It's just all over the place. I would like to update the Oklahoma Open Records Act, eliminate the loopholes, and make sure we have the most transparent government in the history of Oklahoma. Not just for the governor's office, but also for every state agency. They need to all follow the same thing, same guidelines over and over again. I have been fighting for free speech and government transparency for the last 4 years. I'm not going to stop. I want to do everything I can to obtain all the information that I requested, and I'm going to do that. And I encourage everyone to read the laws and hold them accountable. And that's what I want to do.
Well, thanks to all of the candidates for their opening statements, and this would be a fine time to show your appreciation for them. So now we will begin the Q&A portion of this debate, and we'll begin with 3 questions from students here at UCO. These are all students in the Mass Communications program here at UCO, and they will introduce themselves and ask you questions. And again, we'll begin, Chris Powell will take it first, and again, we'll slide on down with each successive question. You'll have 1 minute for your responses.
Hi, my name is Chris Stamm. I'm a senior from the University of Central Oklahoma and a reporter for Youth Central Media. My question is, during a possible 4-year term, what does your commitment to enhancing the quality of our education system look like, and how do you plan to generate the necessary funding to purchase new textbooks, school supplies, and replace broken desks and chairs?
Thank you for the question, Chris. My focus is going to be on moving authority and responsibility away from the politicians at the state capitol and back down to our local school districts, to put the power in the hands of our teachers in our classrooms. In my view, the people who need to be making the decisions about any individual child's education are parents and teachers who know that child. So my approach is going to be to try to increase the amount of funding that comes from local and other sources that is not dependent upon the whims of the legislature, and again, putting that authority at the local level within reach of the parents and within the hands of the educators in the classroom.
Thank you. First, I want to agree with what Rex said about the AG should have turned over the Tar Creek audit and make it clear that it wasn't me. That was one of the AGs that followed me. Now, in answer to your question, I have total commitment to improving education, both K through 12 and also in higher ed. I would put the gross production tax at 7%, not 5, not 4, not 2, 7%. Legislature won't do it. I will see to it that it's on the ballot and the people get a chance to vote on it. Cigarette tax ought to be $1.50, not $1, and I would favor that even if we didn't have a revenue problem because it's a public health issue. It cuts down on youth smoking. Third, I would do away with the capital gains exception to our income tax. It cost us $460 million and only gained us 9. It was supposed to generate additional revenue. It has failed. It needs to go. These and more, and we can't leave out higher ed. It's been cut more than any other state in the nation, and we've got to change that.
Mr. Lawhorn.
Thank you for the question. First thing we need to be aware of is the fact that our K through 12 schools are spending $12,700 plus per student. That puts us below the median in the nation, but not near close to the bottom. The funding structure in the state of Oklahoma has rightfully so pushed it down to the local level. So funding is allocated in a different way in Oklahoma than it is most other states, and that makes it very deceptive when we look at a national side-by-side comparison. They do, part of the reason that they are forwarding the narrative that we are underfunded is because they are trying to hide the fact that they are spending the majority of the money on administration and not in the classroom. If you look at most of the states around us, about 60% of the money goes into the classroom. In Oklahoma, it's about 45%. That's the largest reason that we have teachers are being underpaid, inadequate supplies, broken down textbooks, so on and so forth, etc. My suggestion to fix it goes back to the open records. We audit the local school districts, hold the school boards accountable for how they're spending the money, make them issue a line-by-line budget so that we can see where all of the crony dollars are going instead of into the classroom. In addition to that, we should modernize and we should start looking at more digital resources which are cheaper than textbooks.
Blake Stevens.
Yes, education is at the very top end of my platform. Being an educator in the state of Oklahoma, we all know that we're in real crisis. It's been exposed now, and I appreciate your question. So that being said, if I were the governor, the very first thing that we would start working on would be education. Because see, if you make education number one in your state, then everything else will fall in place. And what I mean by that is we're engaging students in school. We're making them they're being good citizens then, they're being productive citizens, and they have a purpose. And so they're also in school. The way it is, the truancy is what leads. There's a direct correlation with that in our prison. So those things are very important. So I say education has to be funded first. But I also say that before I can tell you the revenue streams and what we need to do with those, and raising taxes and all those kinds of things, you got to get in there with them. You got to find out. You got to dig in there and see. You got to do external audits, all the ones that's necessary. Sorry, thank you.
Dan Fisher.
Well, I would begin by decentralizing the whole education system. A centralized government is grossly inefficient and very unresponsive to the will of the people. When you get beyond that, you've got to cut bureaucracy. You've just got to do it. We're spending way too much money. I agree with what has already been said. Way too much money on administration and bureaucracy. But something that I hear very few people saying is we need to get back to teaching the things that once made us have the greatest education system in the world. We have jettisoned all of the founding principles and all of the things that we used to teach students that actually made us a winning culture. So how about we also change how we're teaching and what we're teaching and get back to the solid things rather than all of these social experiments in our schools, all of these experiments and different kinds of teaching and learning that have turned out not to work, and it's dismal. So I would do all of those things if I'm elected as governor.
Joe Exotic.
That wrapped up a lot. Okay, we got it. Well, everybody said it. We got to get politics out of school. Turn it over to the principals and on a local level. Second thing is we have to concentrate more on trade according to where the schools are. There's people out in rural Oklahoma that don't learn the same thing as people downtown Oklahoma City do. So we got to get back to the basics of where people need to learn what trades to make it through life. How I would do funding, the first thing is we got way too many superintendents making way too much money. Okay, we got 8 in Garvin County, we got 1 in Oklahoma County for a quarter of the people, all right? So we got to take half their salaries away, put that in school, and get rid of half the superintendent. The last thing about funding is I would like to see a campaign cap put on any politician that they can only raise so much money, and the rest of it is a point system. And all those points are gathered by how many donations they got going to the school system to buy those school supplies instead of spending $3 million on a campaign.
Christopher Barnett.
Thank you. First thing I would do if elected is I would reduce my salary as governor from $147,000 a year down to $50,000 a year. I'd lead by example. I'd put salary caps in place on all government employees that work for the state of Oklahoma making over $100,000 a year to $100,000. I would also put that money to education, make sure education is fully funded. I will not raise taxes on anyone. We've invested a lot in wind energy, and the state of Oklahoma doesn't get any of that wind energy. I would raise or put a tax on all wind energy being exported from the state of Oklahoma to other states and put that to education and other services that we need to fund. And transparency, we got to have that to see where all the waste is going, and I would audit every single place.
Gary Jones.
I wouldn't wait. I've already done it. When I first came into office, we discovered that several assessors were not properly assessing their properties. In fact, when and I mentioned to the governor, and she assigned a task force and made me the chairman of that task force. There was only 29 counties who were properly assessing properties. Now there's 74. By the end of this year, all 77, which means more money will go into the schools. Also, when the A-plus plan failed and the step-up plan failed, they said, that's it, we can't do anything else. I stepped forward and put together a plan that Democrats and Republicans came together, which was the 5% gross production tax, 75 cents on cigarettes, 3 cents on gas, and 6 on diesel. Now, they did change the cigarette tax to $1, which I was fine with, but the reason I did those first two items with it was that OCPA and Dr. Tom Coburn endorsed those two items. So now what we're finding is there was a push out there to undo what has been done. So basically what they're saying is, even though we endorsed a plan that was pretty much yours, that because there's an extra quarter on cigarettes and 3 cents on gasoline and 6 on diesel, they're going to try to overturn this. And I will tell you, I'll tell you later.
1 minute goes fast.
It is.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Good evening. Thank you so much for being here. I know there's a lot of conversation about funding K through 12 education, but I'm interested in your thoughts on funding higher education and making that more of a priority in our state.
Thank you. I may have mentioned this earlier. Higher ed in Oklahoma has been cut more than any other state in the nation. Alabama is a distant second, but our percentage cut is more than double theirs. And we just can't, as a result, well, we keep raising tuition. So instead of taxing the oil companies that are making billions of dollars off our oil and gas, they're taxing students to pay for higher education, and that's just wrong. Ultimately, it will price some kids out of college. So the revenues that we can raise and will raise in the coming years has to go to education, and not just common ed, also to higher ed.
Rex Lawhorn.
Again, without disrespect to the conversation that it has been cut significantly, we also have to keep in mind that we are still donating $800 million a year to higher education in the state of Oklahoma. That is a significant amount of money for a state that is 25% in poverty, and that less than half are going to wind up with some form of higher education. A part of the problem that we have is of that $800 million, a lot of it is going, again, to capital investment. They are doing things like having very expensive, on the OU campus, their landscaping contract is exceptionally expensive, way out of proportion for the company budget. They spent their money to build a set of luxury dorms that mostly houses out-of-state students, as opposed to housing Oklahoma students who can't afford the luxury dorms, but still need the education. So once again, it's going to be a matter of prioritizing the spending we have. I mean, we're running in a deficit in a state that's 25% poverty. We'll talk more later. Thank you.
Blake Stevens.
So I believe that our greatest resource is our students that are in higher education. We need to retain those students here as they form their families and keep them here in Oklahoma. But what I see happen so often is they leave our state and they go elsewhere and contribute in other states. So it's very important that we figure out how to do that, and as well as fund And I believe that there's a lot of discussion here that I agree with, actually, that there again, transparency, looking at the structure, seeing where the money's going, following it, and then making provisions with that. Just doing the right thing. And so sometimes you got to step back, or you got to get somebody with fresh eyes to come in there and take a look at that and be involved in that and say, hey, this needs to change. So in my opinion, that's what we need to do in the state of Oklahoma.
Dan Fisher.
Well, as a former school teacher, I obviously believe in education. But our legislature just passed a budget that's going to allocate 60% of the appropriations budget to education. I think a fundamental question has to be asked, how much of the state budget can we dedicate to education? The state does other things as well. I've driven around a lot of campuses, and I noticed that we have some pretty nice facilities. But I also noticed that the smaller schools receive very little funding. I've had presidents ask me, why is it that just the larger schools get the lion's share, the smaller schools get little or nothing? So understand that we've got to equalize this. But see, I'm a Republican who actually believes in small government. The way to find money to function in the core functions is to cut all of the non-core function spending. So we need to shrink the government. Rather than finding ways to tax more, we need to get government out of things it's not supposed to be in, and then we can focus on the things it's supposed to do.
Joe Exotic.
As one paying off a $14,000 student loan for my other half, I know what you're talking about. First thing we got to do is legalize marijuana across the board, and they keep their dirty little hands out of it, okay? And start getting some funding in here. Higher education, I'm all for higher education, okay? But we got some problems with our lower education too. We got people that aren't learning what they need to learn to get out of school in order to get to pay those $14,000 student loan. And then we got to open it up a little bit more to where we have more of a broad base of trade for people to learn in higher education, because not everybody's up to going to UCO for a certain thing. But we don't do anything for trade schools in this state. It's all privately paid trade schools. So I would like to see us, pass 788 and then go to the next step, make it illegal, make it legal and get the funding all in here. Am I out of time already? Okay. And concentrate on not just the higher education, but lower education, meet in the middle, and get some people qualified to be out in the workplace. Now you are. I'm out of time. Okay. It's hard to look at her and see her at the same time.
Christopher Barnett.
First I want to say I understand the high cost there. My husband and I, we paid for college twice now. That's a lot of money, and wow. I love football, let me make that clear, but when I saw what was being spent at some of the universities on football and what some of the coaches were being paid, Bob Stoops last year was paid $5.9 million a year. That kind of funding has got to stop. And again, I love football, but we need to put that to our students. We don't need to raise tuition. We need to be putting that money to our schools, to the higher education, so that tuition's never being raised. If a coach is making $5.9 million a year, I don't want to hear anyone's raising tuition. So all that money needs to go to make sure that tuition is not being raised for our students, so that higher education remains affordable.
Gary Jones.
One thing you need to know is where the source of funding comes from, and I will tell you that I think OU football actually pays for itself. But that being said, one of the things...
Dominic, yeah, I'm sorry. Extended that.
Thank you. Can I start over now? No, so what we need to focus on is that making sure that we do everything we can to provide you a reasonably cost education. And so when we go in, and I've been asked to do a performance audit on all branches of education, so we can focus on making sure that what the dollars that are spent on education truly educates kids. You know, the focus ought to be in college is how can we provide an affordable education for the students, because education is a great equalizer. It doesn't matter where you start in life, if you get a good education, you can go on and achieve anything. And so our focus should be on what we can do to make sure we provide the best education. If there's expenses we're spending that are not for that mission, we should eliminate them and get them down to where we can give you an affordable tuition.
Chris Powell.
Well, I feel your pain because my wife and I are still paying off her student loans for the degree she got here at UCO. And Gary stole my thunder a little bit. I was going to talk about performance audits for higher education and the fact that at our flagship universities, the athletics programs are largely self-funded. I would focus on, as Dan talked a little bit about, our smaller institutions. These are institutions that are more focused on the jobs marketplace and getting students out into the fields that we need people. And I think we need to look at a higher education system that is more geared to supporting the marketplace and producing those kinds of people that can fill positions that we can't fill right now. There are thousands of jobs in this state that are going wanting because we don't have people qualified to fill them, and I think that's where we need to look with education funding.
All right, thanks to Lacey Williams for that question, and now John Hayes.
Hi gentlemen, John Hayes, sophomore here at the University of Central Oklahoma and reporter for U Central News. My question for you all, Oklahoma just endured a very problematic budget crisis that affected almost every issue in the House in terms of funding allocation, with no signs of accountability from those involved. As governor, what do you have planned, and what do you think will be your first step towards implementing a system of accountability so that another future crisis can be avoided?
The first answer from Blake Stevens.
Okay. The biggest reason that we had the budget shortfalls to begin with has to do with how we have our economy structured in the state of Oklahoma. We focus on energy, period, end of conversation, nothing else matters. Because of that, we are subject to the boom-bust cycles of oil and gas, and we also are subject to the whims of out-of-state interests that control the wind industries. By giving them such a large sum of subsidies and tax cuts, we prevent other companies from moving because they are required to shoulder the tax burden. And when the oil price goes way down, you wind up with an $800 million, $1 billion, or $450 million budget deficit. So the thing that we have to do to fix our budget is to diversify our economy. We have to make it an even playing field across the board so that all companies are treated fairly and equally as far as their regulatory burden and their tax burden. And by doing so, our economy is going to explode. We have the prime resources in the state of Oklahoma to be one of the top economies in the country, and the only reason it's not is poor governance and poor leadership.
Blake Stevens.
My angle on this is that we actually have to tear the walls down inside the Capitol building. They're working on the outside of it. We need to really do a lot of work on the inside. I believe that we've got to push the politics aside. We've got to stand up for what's right for Oklahoma and her citizens. Therefore, we've got to engage rather than disengage, because the way that business is conducted in the inside, you wouldn't appreciate. So we've got to restructure that. First of all, the way you do that is you actually expose it. And so then you can start working on it. Because see, we've got to move past all the petty stuff that shouldn't be happening. That's, the stuff that happens in junior high school shouldn't be happening in our Capitol building. And so I'm not being disrespectful at all. I'm just saying this is what we need to do. In order to fix the problems, we have to come together as men and women. And am I out of time already? Good grief.
Dan Fisher.
Well, it's a great question. As I said a while ago, I believe we've grown government. We've done it here in the state just like the federal government has done. From 2006 to 2016, we increased government spending in Oklahoma by just a little under $4 billion. So I think one of the things that we have to do is we have to take an honest look at what government is and is not supposed to be doing. We're about to write a $70 million check to wind energy. Now, I'm not against wind energy, but is that what the government is supposed to be doing? Is that a core function? I watched in the Capitol as special interests have massive influence in what is passed, what is not passed. So we've got to hold our elected officials accountable. Transparency, we have got to put the government out front. People need to know what is happening, and they need to be educated so they can know how to know. It's not easy. So we're going to have to help them to know, and that's exactly what I would do.
Joe Exotic.
We're broke because they don't care. It's not their money. it's your money that they're wasting and spending up there. They don't have to answer to anybody because they won't answer the phone or answer a letter. Every time they screw up, let's punish the guy that smoked your $1.50 a cigarette pack. It doesn't matter. We don't run this state like a business. It's time that we get our parks back up, our infrastructure back up, and we start caring about this state instead of wasting our time writing 4,000 bills and statutes against you every year and coming up with an inspirational song and deciding who can adopt a child in this state. We got to get back to the functions of life, folks, and that is getting Oklahoma to be a business, a functional business that can sustain itself instead of using you for a slush fund.
Christopher Barnett.
We are spending more money than we have. We are paying a lot of government employees, up to 300,000, 400,000, 500,000, lots. We need salary caps. We don't need to raise taxes. We have got to, first of all, get that under control, put all that extra money towards education, and we've got to have the transparency. And Joe said it best. We've got to stop worrying about who can adopt a child, stop putting all these restrictions in place. And we're never going to get anywhere as long as they keep muddy in the waters and trying to distract from what's really happening. We have got to live within our means, and we've got to stop raising taxes on everyone, and we've got to make sure we keep money in the pockets of the people. And until we do that, we're going to stay on the road to disaster. Thank you.
Gary Jones.
Yeah, actually, there's 5 agencies that represent social services and healthcare that have increased tremendously. Virtually all other agencies have gone down. I'll tell you, they passed a tax decrease, quarter-cent tax reduction on the premise in 2014, the premise that revenues were going up because they predicted that revenues were going to go up $60 million the next year, and they actually went down $742 million. So a huge estimate, didn't do a very good job estimating. So what I'm saying, while we need to make sure that every dollar is spent wisely, Governor Fallon 3 years ago said we should reduce 10% of all the non-mission critical expenses. We should eliminate 100% of all non-mission critical expenses and make sure that we're funding those core services in a manner that we should. But the premise that revenues have gone up astronomically, that's not really true. It has to do with social services and healthcare, but all others have gone down tremendously.
Chris Powell.
As I understood the question, it was about the budget process, and our budget process is pretty terrible. We have 3 sets of numbers that are produced for a budget, one from the Senate, one from the House, and one from the governor, and those can't all be right because they're all going to be different. And then those budgets are all cooked up in back rooms where you don't get to see it. So obviously we need transparency in the process. We did have 1 year in the state legislature, 2013 I think, when there was a lot more openness in the process under Speaker Shannon, and it lasted 1 year. It was decided by a lot of the people funding these political campaigns that they didn't want that anymore. So we need to move back to that. We need a more open process, and we need one that makes sense. I would certainly consider looking at the Miller Plan, which would make 1 session of every legislature dedicated just to budget.
Drew Edmondson.
Number one, I would insist on zero-based budgeting where every agency has to justify its budget from $1, not just justify an increase. Number two, I would work with the Attorney General and the state auditor to make sure state agencies are lean, clean, and efficient. Make sure we root out corruption or misuse of money. Thirdly, I want to make a point that the only tax increase that I've asked for is cigarette tax. Sorry, Joe. But I do think it impacts on youth smoking, and I think the lives of our children and grandchildren are worth it. The other things that I've called for have been closing loopholes that primarily benefit the rich. And if we didn't need to do that, then we wouldn't have 1,950 provisional teachers aren't fully qualified. We wouldn't be number 1 in teen pregnancy. We wouldn't have the other problems that we're facing if we did not have what Mary Fallon said last year was a revenue problem, and what Step Up Oklahoma said the same thing this year.
And thank you to the UCO students for their questions, Chris Stum, Lacey Williams, and John Hayes. This is the FOI Oklahoma 2018 gubernatorial debate, and now we move to questions from our audience. And this first question will go to Blake Stevens. Will each of you promise not to invoke executive or deliberative process privileges to deny access to records and instead rely only on the state's statutory exemptions?
Wow. So, where do I start with this question? I'm not even sure what the question is. I'm sorry. So, I've got the deer in the headlight looks. The exemptions on the open, what'd you say, records?
Yes.
I apologize. So, I don't know. Honestly, I don't know. I'd have to study into that. I'm not sure, and I'd like to answer the question. So, yes, sir. So I'd rather pass on the question. I apologize for doing that, but I'm not going to know how to answer. I'm sorry.
Thank you. We'll move to Dan Fisher.
Well, I believe there are times when some strategy meetings need to be strategy meetings. When I was in the House, you have the Republican caucus, you have the Democrat caucus. And there are things that need to be discussed and strategy that may not necessarily need to be blown out to the public. But when it comes to official business of the government, I would make everything available that I did as governor. I'm not going to be doing anything wrong, so I don't have anything to hide. You see, the only reason government wants to hide is because it's doing things that it knows you wouldn't like. So there's no need in hiding if you're doing what you know is constitutional and legal. So I wouldn't need to claim executive privilege to hide what I'm doing as governor, because I won't be doing anything that I would be embarrassed to tell you in public. In fact, my whole life has been lived that way, and if you elect me as governor, I promise you, you will have the most open, transparent governor. I've been yelling for years the government needs to open its doors. I will make that happen.
Joe Exotic.
You're going to have even a more open government if I win, because there shouldn't be any closed meeting or strategizing or anything else, because it's you, the people of this state. And you should have a voice, you should have an opinion, and you should know what's going on. Down from committee meetings to everything else. And there shouldn't be any one person in a committee meeting of anything to have the power to say, I'm going to read this bill or I'm not going to read this bill. That's not what this state's about. This state's about you, the people. And by God, you may think that we're all playing some kind of game up here, but this is time that the state of Oklahoma takes its rights back, and you, the people, have a voice, and you sit in on any damn thing you want to sit in on, because that's your right.
Christopher Barnett.
Let me be clear, 100% open transparency. I will never, ever restrict any of the records. It doesn't matter how bad it makes me look. Doesn't matter how much we screwed up. Everyone's going to see it. Everyone needs to see it. The people have the inherent right to know. It's in our Constitution. The Supreme Court of Oklahoma has held it over and over again. I will not use any executive privilege whatsoever to hide anything. Everything needs to be seen by the people. Otherwise, they cannot participate in government. Thank you.
Gary Jones.
Could you please repeat the question?
Yes. The question is this. Will each of you promise not to invoke executive or deliberative process privileges to deny access to records and instead rely only on the state's statutory exemptions?
Absolutely. I think the statutory exemptions define everything. And so, yes, I would adhere to that.
Chris Powell.
Yes.
Drew Edmondson.
Also, yes, and frankly, I was surprised, number one, that Governor Fallon claimed executive privilege on some documents that were being sought, and number two, that the Supreme Court agreed with her and agreed that there was an executive privilege, which is not in the statutes. But I'm a firm believer in it's in Latin, non omni quod licet honestum est. Not all that is legal is honest. And I would reveal the records if they didn't fall into an exception in the black and white language of the Open Records Act. They would be an open record in my administration.
Rex Lawhorn.
I've already told you how I'd handle this. I've already invited every single one of you into my office as governor. On top of that, since the very beginning, I said that I'm going to maintain an open Twitter account and an open Facebook account that is going to openly tell you everything that I am doing while I am in office. And it's probably going to have some of my social engagements on there as well. But there is nothing more critical to fixing the state of Oklahoma than the people of Oklahoma knowing exactly what is going on every step of the way. I'm not just going to be putting the things that I do on there. I'm going to be telling you about what's being debated in the legislature, what's being debated in the courts, what cases are coming before the Supreme Court, what cases are going on in the Attorney General's office without giving details, because those are going to be ongoing investigations, and that might hinder the state of Oklahoma from prosecuting some of the crimes that I'm going to root out while I'm there. But yes, absolute transparency, and I will never use any exemption to hide anything that takes place in my office.
Thank you, gentlemen. The next question comes in from somebody who's following this online. It comes in the form of a tweet. And the question is, how do we balance free speech, religious freedom in public schools? And we start with Dan Fisher.
Well, I believe the easiest answer to that is return control of the schools back to the people, rather than having it run by bureaucrats and centralized government, as I said earlier. So one of the things that we have to do is we have to stop allowing Washington, D.C., and even here in the state of Oklahoma, the State Department of Education to call all the shots. Every community is different. Every district is different. It's the citizens who are paying the taxes. So if we return control back to the local district, let the district run its schools. Get the government out of all of the social experimentation, the trying to rid our culture of its own beliefs, and let the people run their government. That's part of what transparency is about. And Joe is right. It's not the government's money. It's not the government's schools. It's yours. It is the people's. And so the way to do it is to return control to the people.
Joe Exotic.
Why, he stole my whole line. I have to agree with Dan. He pretty much wrapped it up right there. Again, let's just use rural Oklahoma versus Oklahoma City. The people that have the students in that school should have the say of what goes on in that school. Freedom of speech is only freedom of speech until it offends somebody. Okay? So something that might go on outside Oklahoma City might get away with something inside Oklahoma City. So again, we got to get the politicians and bureaucrats out of school. Turn it over to the parents at the PTA meetings. You decide what is going on in your school. You decide if you want an opening prayer or 5 minutes of silence or a minute of silence in your school before your school starts. That shouldn't be a politician's job. And the politicians need to get completely the hell out of school and religion and freedom of speech.
Christopher Barnett.
Can you do me a favor and repeat the question one more time? Just make sure I'm part of it.
Sure. How do we balance free speech and religious freedom in public schools?
Well, free speech is just that. If someone wants to pray in a public school, the government shouldn't be able to tell them, no, you can't do that. At the same time, if they're trying to force everyone to pray, that's an issue. So if a teacher wants to pray, if a teacher and students want to pray, they have every right to do that. Freedom of religion is also covered under that. So I fully support everyone's right to pray, to be a part of any religion in public school, and to do so legally. The government doesn't need to tell anyone they can't pray in school. We do need to take them out, take the government out of the schools, and we need to make sure that everyone has the right to freedom of speech and freedom of religion in the schools. Thank you.
Gary Jones.
Yeah, I believe the local school boards are the best to adhere to those rules and regulations, and I would leave that to the local school boards.
All right, Chris Powell.
The freedom of expression of anybody who is at the school as a student is certainly something that needs to be protected, but the staff of the school who has authority over all of those students needs to be cognizant of the fact that they do have, there is a compulsion to be there. So they don't get to indoctrinate students into something that the parents would object to. So we need to be careful about that, but certainly every student's freedom of expression, freedom of religion, within the bounds of not causing disruptions within the classroom, things of that nature, needs to be protected.
Drew Edmondson.
The students in Oklahoma and any other state in the union have a right to pray. The courts have upheld that. They can gather at the flagpole, they can gather before school, they can gather after school. What's prohibited, because the First Amendment has both a freedom clause and a prohibition against establishing religion. So what's prohibited is a teacher or a principal or a school board telling them what they're going to pray, or what Bible verse they're going to read, or what verse out of the Quran or the Talmud. That does not happen in this country because of the prohibition against establishing religion. So of course there should be prayer in school, and as long as there's algebra, there will be prayer in the schools. But the principal can't tell them what they're going to pray.
Rex Lawhorn.
I'm going to take a moment and point out a little contention with the question itself when it says that we need to balance the rights. There is no balancing the rights. The rights are absolute, endowed by our Creator. When we have the discussion about what's taking place, it's not a matter of whether or not the student's rights are being protected. It's a matter of whether or not the school or the government is trying to infringe on those rights, because those rights are inherent from their very existence. If a student wishes to pray and they are required to pray 5 times a day, they need to be allowed to pray their 5 times a day. That is their freedom of religion and their freedom of expression. If there is a teacher that is trying to infringe upon those rights, that teacher needs to be removed from the classroom, period. End of conversation. Because the first 2 amendments of the Constitution are fundamental to the American way of life. The first one allows participation of the electorate through peace. The second allows participation of the electorate through war. So they are sacrosanct and cannot be infringed by anybody.
Blake Stevens.
I also agree that it should be up to your local school districts, and I believe 100% that taking prayer out of the schools, and those that believe in prayer and believe in God, but whatever their religion is, they should be able to practice that in school and in their life, which is a big part of their life is school. And being an educator, I know myself that my experience has been that the kids spend more time with their teachers and their principals and their counselors and their support staff than they do with a lot of their own family. And this is the truth. So we become their family. And so what can be modeled, we have our hands tied on what we can do and can't do. And so, we have to understand that, and we don't want to cross any lines. Most of us, we have to. It's just the law. So I appreciate your
Time. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, gentlemen. The next question concerns education. And here it is. Oklahoma's economy appears to be booming, and its infrastructure continues to expand as businesses are growing. However, many Oklahomans do not have the post-secondary degrees needed for our future workforce. What measures do you propose that we take to solidify a stronger connection between the business community and our educational system to best prepare Oklahomans for work? Beginning with Joe Exotic.
I don't know where you live. Where I live, it's not booming. And you can't find no help. And that's being honest. So we're dealing with people, and I employ 37 people, and they can't find their way to work on time. They ain't got a car. They got 4 kids. They got to be at probation or court all the time from being arrested. And that, God forbid, they got to count change or function. So that question is like way over my head, because I'm not in the big tower in downtown Oklahoma City on one Main Street or whatever it's called, where corporate America never sees the rest of Oklahoma. But I don't think Oklahoma's booming all that well, because we're $800 million over budget. all right? And we gave so many tax breaks that we can't afford anything in this state, let alone education. So again, I go back to the basics. We gotta teach people in pre-K to 12th grade how to function as normal human beings in this life instead of corporate America. And let's get them started in that step first.
Christopher Barnett.
I own 3 businesses in Tulsa, and I agree it's hard to find help. I don't think our economy is booming right now. I have scheduled a lot of interviews for a lot of people. Doesn't matter what the pay is. Half the time, people don't show up because they're on unemployment. They're required to apply for 2 jobs a week, and that's all there is. There's no oversight on that. So they apply, they never show up, and that's an issue. I have a lot of people that quit because once they start working, their food stamps will get pulled. And so it's an issue. I really don't know what we can do to make that get better between the education and jobs, but I don't think our economy is booming at all.
Same question for Gary Jones.
Yeah, one thing we need to do is to really focus on trying to work with all different branches of education, Common Ed, Career Tech, and Higher Ed, and break down the silos. We tend to push too many kids that don't really know that want to go to college, and they run up a big student debt before they go into a profession. We need to do more like Europe does, where we early on identify certain things that they want to do. If they want to be an electrician, let's put apprenticeships where they can go be an apprentice and try that out. And usually the ones that do well at that get hired. And there's multiple things throughout the state. I actually live in rural Oklahoma, and Blake, I do own cows. I'm a cowboy. I just not dressed for it today. But there are certain things that you can do in agriculture. For instance, people are looking for agriculture technicians. They can't find people to do that. You could put them in apprentice programs in the rural areas. So match up the jobs with the jobs that are out there, and then have that system where if a business wants to come in here, we have a program by which that we have a pipeline to train those people, just like they do in Europe.
Chris Powell.
I think I touched on this a little bit when I was answering Lacey's question earlier about our small colleges being a lot more geared to the marketplace as far as producing people who get out of that institution and are ready to go straight to work. We need more of that, and we need more of like apprentice programs and other ways of reducing barriers to entering the workforce. But when we look at education, one of the problems that we have is that we have a lot of focus on the certification and not as so much focus on the skills that we're trying to get people to have so that they're ready to go. And we have a lot of companies that use that degree as a way to narrow, to cull their applicants rather than really trying to look for the people who are best qualified to enter their particular position. If a company is hiring based on having a degree or not, and that degree is not being used in that job, they need to reconsider their approach.
Drew Edmondson.
I would also take issue with the basic premise. We've had a recent uptick in the economy in Oklahoma, but I don't think that means we're booming. We've gone through about 7 years where we've had billion-dollar holes in our budget for years in a row. Our bond rating has been lowered. We have been suffering, and I hope that the recent uptick is a sign that we're turning that around, but I don't think we're going to turn it around until we start bringing in new industry and encouraging existing businesses to expand. And we're not going to do that if we've lost our STEM education in our schools because of lack of funding. We're not going to do that as long as we're 2,000 to 3,000 teachers short. We're not going to do that as long as we've got 1/5 of our districts teaching 4-day school weeks. We've got to invest in education, including higher ed, before this economy is really going to start moving.
Rex Lawhorn.
The state of Oklahoma is ideally suited for using the Swiss-style apprenticeships, where after the 10th grade year, they make a decision if they're going to go into a career track, and they have a company that partners with them. That person goes to work for half the day, being trained for a specific job that they will be working after they get out of high school, at which point in time they go to work after high school for a job that the company already trained them for, and they become full-time employees. In the diverse economy that we have today, There's no way to have a degree path for every single career field out there. There's just too many different areas. And even if there were, it would be impossible for one state to be able to provide that education. As education goes forward in the future, we're going to see more and more of that being a requirement as opposed to an alternative to secondary education or higher education because of the extreme diversity of career fields, and it's just going to get larger. Oklahoma can actually be on the forefront of this form of educational technology if we'll just take the step and do it. Thank you.
Blake Stevens.
Well, I talked earlier about education being #1 in our state, and we do that, then there again we'll have economic growth, and people will be wanting to bring their headquarters here to the state of Oklahoma. And so our teachers that I also commented earlier, and the rate that we're releasing them at is a crisis. And so that tells everyone outside of Oklahoma, this is the last place we want to go. So when we replace those teachers in those classrooms that have been there to lead and model what students, the direction students should be going and fulfilling a full life, then you're replacing them with non-certified staff that are not untrained. So it's important to know that by doing that, we're furthering going down the hill. It's the wrong direction. So we need to understand that and know that teachers and counselors and principals move those kids into other professions and into, sorry, I'm out of time.
Thank you. Dan Fisher.
Last year, our colleges and universities told us that 40% of the graduates of high school had to go through remediation. We're obviously not teaching the fundamentals. We're also not teaching things like work ethic, responsibility. We're too busy experimenting on new techniques. We need to get back to the fundamentals. After World War II, we also started preaching something that now has just become accepted fact. As soon as you're out of high school, you go to a 4-year degree school. Now, all respect to this school, but that's not the path that all students need to take. I know lots of students who get a 4-year degree, come out, can't find a job, and go to work for fast food. So it's not always the right path for a student to go get a bachelor's degree. I know students who go to trade schools and come out making $70,000, $80,000, $90,000 a year. So we need to rethink the way that we educate in this country, or we're going to continue getting what we're getting because we're going to keep doing what we're doing.
Thank you, gentlemen. And you are watching the FOI Oklahoma 2018 Gubernatorial Debate. And our next question also comes from Twitter. And we will begin with Christopher Barnett with this one. How would you, as governor, make sure Oklahoma schools are safe?
It's a fun question. Wow. But first and foremost, I fully support the Second Amendment. I think that teachers who want to carry, either concealed or open carry, should. I think that we've got to make sure that our schools have a lot more. Wow, didn't even think about that. But we've got to make sure that our teachers are able to protect the students. We've got to make sure that we have more deputies, more support staff there to assist and make them safer.
Gary Jones.
Yeah, I believe that we ought to be armed teachers, but I think they ought to go through a rigorous program. If they're former law enforcement officers or military training, I think that we need to make sure that they indeed know how to handle a firearm and that they have been tested, and to assure that they don't become a threat within the school system, but they become a deterrent by making sure that they are well qualified and well trained.
Chris Powell.
Well, I'll push back on the question by pointing out that if you look at mass shootings in schools since 1990, with over more than 2 victims, the total number of fatalities of students is 198. That's a very low number. That's about 10 a year. Compare that to the 100 or so a year children who are killed riding bikes or on their way to school. Our schools are safe, and we need to stop scaring children by making them think that they're not. I'll also point out that I don't know how many of you heard about it. It didn't get the play as some of the other stories did, of the gentleman at the Waffle House who took an AR-15 away from a shooter and ended that incident. I'll point out the Waffle House is not a gun-free zone, and that an individual resisting is what ended that situation.
Drew Edmondson.
Well, I don't think putting more guns in the schools is the answer. Not the least reason of which is if there is an active shooter in a school and the SWAT team comes in, anybody who has a gun that is visible is a target of the SWAT team. I also wonder about where they're going to keep it during the day. They're going to have it strapped on their sidearm. They're going to have it locked in a drawer. Is it going to be a place where kids can get access to it? All of those things worry. So secure the entrance. Have one entrance to the school. Make sure it's secured. Make sure a metal detector is in place. Do that right off the bat. And make sure that security is there or available at the school. And keep in mind, securing the schools is important, but they're not the only place that's at risk. There have been shootings in movies, shopping centers. We live in dangerous times.
Rex Lawhorn.
The media has done a very good job of spotlighting the issues that we've had over the last couple of decades as far as being unsafe in schools or any other location for that matter. The most important thing that we need to remember is that the vast majority of these, like over 90% of them, take place in gun-free zones because the people who perpetrate these crimes are sick and they are cowards. And they are going to go to the place where they are going to have the least resistance. Just by removing the gun-free zone restriction itself is going to go a long way toward making schools safer, even though they are already safe. In addition to that, we need to identify much better the people who have this type of illness and have these concerns earlier along in the process. This is something that I've been preaching about from the beginning. We need to be aware of what's going on in the schools, and we need to be identifying potential problems before they become a problem. We can do that by increasing our counselors' ability in order to have more meaningful conversations with the students and to better identify them, greater parental involvement. But between those two things will go a long way toward making schools as safe as they can be.
Blake Stevens.
I believe that we have a lot of things in place in Oklahoma that are great for our students and our staff and keeping them safe. They regularly have lockdown drills, and we've learned that you don't do a lockdown drill in a situation where you have an intruder. You're trained differently than if it's a tornado. And so you're definitely just not trying to hide now. You're defending yourself and you're arming yourself in the classrooms. They're locking the doors. And the doors at our buildings are already locked at Locust Grove. So there's already measures in place that we've used, and it's very successful. We have a resource officer as well that goes to our different campuses. So as far as arming our teachers, I have mixed feelings about that. I believe in the Second Amendment right. I'm 100% for that. And I just think that you have to pay attention to giving guns to teachers that may not know how to use them. So that's something to definitely talk about.
Dan Fisher.
Well, it seems to me that our culture keeps ignoring the elephant in the room. When I went to high school, there were rifles in the back windows of pickups, and people had been hunting that morning or that afternoon. I wasn't fearful of being shot. We need to admit the fact that we're becoming an ever more immoral culture, and we ignore that to our peril. So we need to begin to address that. Now, because we are living in this incredibly immoral culture, we need to arm trained teachers and have officers at the doors. It's terrible, but that's just the way it is. These people that have mental issues and incredible moral issues find these schools and theaters and other places where they are gun-free, target-rich environments. I don't like the idea of guns being at school, but guys, we might as well admit it. If we're not going to fix the moral condition in our country, you better arm up. And so we better teach and train our teachers how to protect our kids and put officers there. But I would say that we also need to begin to look at our moral fiber. What are we not teaching in this culture?
Joe Exotic.
I carry a gun 24/7 until I walked in this building today, so if his gun jams, y'all are screwed. First of all, I really don't think we have a problem in Oklahoma, okay? I'm the first one to carry a gun. but I don't think they belong in our schools. I think we need to start off by our mental health problems, our bullying problems, teaching some respect in schools. Instead of our politicians passing laws and setting examples on TV, let's discriminate, let's hate, let's pass a bill, let's make you different than the next guy. Okay, that's where it starts. We didn't have this problem in the 90s. You're not going to stop a crazy person from being crazy, but we can get them some help and we can identify who they are and we can get them out of school. And if you didn't have to hire security guards and armed guards and everything else in school, you might be able to afford some school funding. So let's get it back to school, okay? I don't think we're going to have too many mass shootings in Oklahoma.
This is the FOI Oklahoma 2018 Gubernatorial Debate at the University of Central Oklahoma. The next question concerns the First Amendment. A bill was recently passed allowing adoption agencies to deny service to same-sex couples. How does your interpretation of the First Amendment address discrimination on religious grounds and religious liberty? Gary Jones.
I think the first thing we ought to do on adoption is to look what's best for the children. We ought to focus on that. And there's a lot of children that are not adopted because we don't have enough programs together to help with foster care and to adoption, to help people with the adoption process. And I think we ought to focus on that. And I think sometimes we get off in the weeds and other things. And I think that we need to put the kids first.
Chris Powell.
As an adoptive parent, I'm somebody who's very familiar with the fact that we have, for a long time in this state, been taking too many children into state custody, which is whatever happened to them that caused that. That's an additional trauma, and we need to be careful about exercising that authority. And we have a lack of foster parents and adoptive parents. That is certainly true. If you have a concern about this issue, I urge you to consider being a foster or adoptive parent yourself. As far as the bill goes, we do have freedom of religion, and organizations do have the right to operate as they choose, but they don't have the right to do it on the public dollar. Government money should not be used for discrimination.
Drew Edmondson.
It's my understanding that the bill at question here was amended to provide that private adoption agencies that wanted to stay private could adopt out to anybody that they wanted to. If they wanted to only adopt out children to Catholic families, they could do that, or any other area that they wanted to discriminate. And the bill was amended to say you can do that, except you can't do it through DHS, which I think is exactly what Chris was talking about. Private agencies, if they want to stay private, can do what they want as long as they're not jeopardizing the children, but they can't do it with public money.
Rex Lawhorn.
Any organization that has any affiliation with the state whatsoever has to abide by non-discrimination, period, end of conversation. The government cannot establish any type of discrimination based on any reason, whether it be the color of the skin, the sexual persuasion, any of it. However, if there is a company that's operating as a private entity, there is a parent putting a child with that agency for the purpose of that company completing its mission. If that mission is ensuring that their child is going to be raised by a Catholic organization, then that is what needs to happen. They need to be allowed to complete that mission. It's the way the industry works. It's the way the consumers work. The consumer always has the option to choose whatever organization that they wish to operate with. And if they choose to operate with one that chooses to discriminate against someone based off of sexual persuasion, that is their right, as that is their child. Discrimination is repugnant in any form. However, if people are going to do it, they need to make sure it's not affiliated with the government.
Blake Stevens.
What he said. No, I agree that my position on that is for sure that public government that you're depending on your orientation, sexual orientation, that we have to abide by that, and we can't use funding for that. So yes, in private industry or private adoptions and foster, then I believe that's a horse of a different color. So I do understand too, because I work as a school counselor, like I said, for 21 years, that there is a serious need for our children and the families and the drug use and the substance abuse in our homes is deteriorating, and our children are paying the price for that. So I agree with you, Chris. Anyone that has that, that has that calling in their heart, then I hope that you will consider this, because they need you.
Dan Fisher.
Well, I believe we either have religious freedom or we don't. So if someone's privately practicing, whether it's an adoption agency or a bakery or a florist, if they're a private business, they should not be forced by government to violate their conscience and their religious beliefs. This is a country of choice. If people don't want to do business with those folks, they can go to another place. Now, if they're working on public money, obviously that's different. So we must always default to liberty. And sometimes that's difficult. It gets difficult at times. Joe said a while ago that we always have free speech until we say something that's offensive to someone, then we want to shut them down. It's ridiculous. We fought a war of independence for liberty. So we cannot force people to violate their religious or political or other convictions. So that would be my position.
Joe Exotic.
They got the two ministers on this end of the table. Why are we having this discussion? Private adoption agency is a private business. Why are we even involved? If they want to discriminate and run themselves out of business, that's their choice, okay? But people that adopt from that agency shouldn't get a $13,000 tax cut, all right? The state shouldn't have anything to do with this. Private agency, the state shouldn't even have anything to do with adoption. If I want to adopt my child out to you for free and you can take care of it, that should be your choice. We're sitting here arguing about whether or not a gay couple can have a kid, but somebody on meth can have 4 and the state's paying for them. We have some issues going on, and we got our nose in way too many people's business, and that's where it's got to stop first.
Christopher Barnett.
It's a loaded question. My husband and I, we hope to adopt at least 10 kids one day. We're both Christians, and this law discriminates against gay couples, and I do agree with Joe, why are we talking about it? But it does discriminate against gay couples, a lot of people. And yes, those private organizations have the right to discriminate, but we're Christians, but we're being told we can't adopt because we're gay and yet we're a married couple. So I have a problem with that, and it is a private business, but I don't think there should be any discrimination at all. Too many kids need homes.
All right, thank you, gentlemen. Our next question comes from Twitter, and it has to do somewhat with criminal justice reform. The question is, should marijuana be decriminalized? And I believe we are now at Chris starting, is that right? Or, yeah, yes, Chris Powell. Yes.
We definitely need to pass 788 on June 26th. Be sure and get out and vote yes on State Question 788. If you're a registered libertarian, you can also mark that box for Chris Powell. I appreciate that. And we need to move beyond that to look at drug prohibition in general, which is a destructive policy, and we need to try a different approach. We are filling our prisons with people because of something they are doing to themselves and not others, and it is too expensive, it's not moral, and we're putting ourselves in a position with our criminal justice system that we have too many people who shouldn't be there in that system, so that we have people who are really dangerous and should be locked away, and we can't keep them in because we have too many of these other people that shouldn't be there in the first place, and we keep those people from being able to get jobs when they get out. And yes on 788.
Drew Edmondson.
No, I agree on the yes on 788, the medical marijuana. I think the science is in on that. The person who asked the question used the word decriminalized as opposed to legalized. And I'm assuming the person who asked the question is making a distinction between the two. We took a step toward decriminalization November of 2016 when we passed State Question 780, where simple possession of marijuana and a number of other drugs were reduced from felony to misdemeanor, even on a second or third offense. And that's moving in the direction of decriminalization, where people will not go to the penitentiary. And I think the people made a wise decision in that vote.
Rex Lawhorn.
788 is a good first step. It needs to go all the way to legalization, and then that's the end of it on that. We have a lot of people that are sitting in prisons for smoking a plant, which I would venture to say over half the people in this room have taken a nip off the bottle every once in a while. I know I enjoy a glass of whiskey every so often, and I don't believe that somebody should be sitting in state prison for 20 years to life because they chose to smoke a plant instead of drink a liquid. The second thing that we need to consider is the fact that all the people that are sitting in prison are there immorally. They are never hurt anybody else, and they never did anything to anybody else's property. So we are sitting here paying anywhere between $160 and $300 million a year in order to prosecute, convict, and house these people. Yet we can have a rapist down at a Baptist camp in southern Oklahoma be sent home with a collar around his ankle for raping a 13-year-old girl. And you tell me what the moral answer is.
Blake Stevens.
Good point, and I agree with that and what's been said. I believe that, yes, we need to relook at that and restructure that, because you know what the facts are, that a murderer can get out a lot quicker than someone that is in prison for drugs. And so with that being said, I definitely agree that we need to move into a direction where we decriminalize and instead of putting them in prison. We have to figure out how, though, that we can also protect our public. So my thoughts are on fatality wrecks in the state of Oklahoma. It's come to my attention that with alcohol, that if we don't require the person involved in the wreck to have a sobriety or a blood test, And so that being said, if we're going to go forward with medical marijuana, we need to look at that in a serious way and make sure that we have blood tests for any fatality wreck that's on our highways.
Dan Fisher.
I am in full support of medical marijuana. I do not support 788 because I have issues with the ways that it is presently worded. But let me also speak about criminal reform. I believe one of the major mistakes that we make is we treat nonviolent criminals quite often as violent criminals. All we do then when we lock them up is turn them into violent criminals. So one of the things I would want to do is to refocus and begin to design a system where the nonviolent criminals go through a restoration program, where literally they're not locked up, but they give restitution for the crime that they have committed, monetarily, whatever, and then they are restored. But let me also say once again, that one of the reasons we have this growing problem is we keep ignoring the basic issue, and that is downward spiraling basic morality. Until we recognize that fact, we're not going to fix it.
Joe Exotic.
Just for the record, I don't smoke weed. Got the long hair, but I don't do well with weed. All right. I am all for legalizing it clear across the board because I'm a businessman. We can make some money. All right. Seattle, Washington just petitioned to decriminalize marijuana there for 30 past years. If you have a record of any kind of marijuana charge, they are fixing to expunge your records for the past 30 years. Here in the state of Oklahoma, we have nearly 50 people on life sentences for pot. Okay? We are paying them to be in prison for life for weed. But you can get a DUI and be out of jail the next day. My brother was killed by a drunk driver. Never spent a day in jail. Okay? I'm for letting all nonviolent felons vote because that should be their right.
Christopher Barnett.
I am all for legalizing marijuana, but I don't think it should just be for medical. It should be 100% across the board. God made it. People should be able to smoke it without going to prison. We shouldn't be filling our prisons with nonviolent offenders. And in my research, I've never been able to find anyone who has killed someone simply by smoking marijuana. In fact, they fall asleep. I have never smoked marijuana. I've had some great brownies, and I fell asleep. And I'm all for legalizing 100%, not just for medical, all the way across the board, no exceptions.
Gary Jones.
Talking to physicians, I believe that we ought to have medical marijuana. I don't believe we should open it up for just recreational use. We need to make sure that the 788 has the safeguards in there that doesn't do that. And so if it's the will of the people to pass that as medical marijuana, I think that we need to make sure that there are safeguards that are in place that does not allow that to migrate into recreational use.
For this next question, we begin with Drew Edmondson, and it is this. It's about government transparency. What can the governor's office do, more specifically, what would you do as governor, to enforce the law and the spirit of open meetings and open records in municipal and county government and the state legislature?
Thank you. We have proposed in our campaign a couple of things. One, and this was mentioned by others earlier, we believe the legislature should be subject to open meeting and open record laws. And it may be difficult for the legislature to vote that in, but if they don't, then we should consider putting it on the ballot and giving people an opportunity to vote on it. Second, I intend to have a person in my office that has that responsibility, an ombudsman for openness in government, to field inquiries, to assist citizens in obtaining records or access to meetings that they're currently being denied. They can call the governor's office and get help.
Rex Lawhorn.
No, I talked about everything that I would do as governor earlier in order to enforce the idea of openness and transparency. The question also addressed what could happen at the county and local levels. There are a lot of issues. That's something that Oklahoma has historically had a problem with, is corruption at the county and local level. It's still something that we see every day. It's my understanding, and I'm no attorney, but that if the state has a rule that the government in the state of Oklahoma is required to take X action, then that also applies to the county and local governments as well. So if we had an open records law that applied universally across the board in the state of Oklahoma, they would also have to comply with that. If they chose not to, I've got an attorney general in my pocket that I can say, it looks like we've got some issues going down in Comanche County, or whatever the situation would be. I need you to go investigate and make sure that there is no corruption taking place.
Blake Stevens?
I believe that we do need to start with 100% transparency at the top all the way down, or at the bottom and all the way up. In my case, if I get elected to be your governor, then it would start with me, and I would model that. And yes, I would have, I would push for everything to be open to the public, and as far as legally could be done. There again, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know those kinds of things either. What I do know is that I'm 100% transparent. I also know that I have honesty and integrity, and that's what I take to this office, and that's what I bring, is a fresh set of eyes to this. So I would also, like I say, believe that it should go down through all branches, or not branches, but all levels, all the way down to your local level.
Dan Fisher.
Well, trust in government is at an all-time low. And that's because those in government have betrayed the trust of the people. They've lied to them when they've campaigned. They've said, I'm for this, then they don't support that. I'm against this, then they do support that. So one of the things we must do is require that those that we elect actually live up to what they said they would do. But I'll tell you something else that we need to do. We need to have a governor who leads. Have you heard any talk from the governor's office in how long about transparency in a public fashion? So one of the things that I would do as governor is I would simply lead. If a governor will lead, the team will play. The problem is we're not playing up to our leadership because we don't have the right kind of leadership. And then last of all, I believe that at the local level, audits can be performed. Auditor Jones knows this. You can audit these local entities, and when you do, you begin to bring some transparency. So there are a lot of things that you can do, but it all rises or falls on leadership.
Joe Exotic.
Crooked politicians start as little mini politicians called city council members. That's where your corruption starts. How many city council members or city council meetings have you ever been to that they have closed door meetings? Or the county commissioners have closed door meetings? Well, why are they closed doors? They've got to be open so you, the public, can understand what's going on behind them little closed doors back there. All right, and then it's gotta work its way up to the Capitol. We can't start at the top and work its way down. We gotta start at the bottom and rebuild this whole thing back up to the top. Transparency is all this state's about, knowing what is going on by you, the people that vote these crooked little people in there, all right? This will be the most important election the state of Oklahoma ever will have, because this will either be the next 4 years that will either break this state or make this state. And it's up to you, whether you want transparency or you want to stay with the little crooked politicians.
Christopher Barnett.
I agree with what Drew Edmondson and Joe Exotic here said. One thing a lot of people don't realize or know is that judges are exempt from the Open Records Act. I would stop that, and I would make every single judge have to comply with the Open Records Act and be fully transparent. Right now, some of the lawsuits I'm involved in, we know that the judges are corrupt, and we'd love to get that out there, but they're fighting those subpoenas that we've sent, and they need to be transparent so we have honesty in our judicial system. And right now, we don't have that in Oklahoma.
Gary Jones.
Yes, because obviously the municipalities and trust authorities and counties are subject to open meetings, open records, and we audit the counties, and we have written them up many, many times. In fact, they know that if they violate those, we're going to write them up. Used to in the past, that wasn't done because someone would call the auditor's office and they would ask it to be taken out, and they'd take it out. We don't play that game. And so while we get called in to audit cities on special request, we do write them up for everything that's a violation of the law, including the open meetings, open records. And as governor, what I would do is make sure that we have a system in place by which that anybody can report one of those violations to us, and we'll ensure that it's investigated, and if indeed they violate it, that we expose it.
Chris Powell.
Dr. John Yider is a Libertarian candidate for state auditor, and I believe that he will be just as diligent, if not more so, than Mr. Jones has as far as making sure that these county and municipal entities adhere to the rules and not try to hide things. We certainly do need more transparency. We see issues about that all the time, often brought up by members of FOI Oklahoma. So we certainly appreciate that. One thing that the governor can do is, and I think this has been alluded to, is lead. We've had for the past 8 years a governor who, despite also signing the Open Government Pledge back in 2010 along with Drew, has fought several times on many issues releasing information. So as governor, I'm not going to fight when people want information that they're entitled to have. And that'll make a big difference.
Thank you, gentlemen. Our next question, and perhaps our last, has to do with education. Study after study shows the long-term benefits and cost savings of investing in early childhood education. And yet Oklahoma, despite leading the way in the implementation of universal pre-K decades ago, now lags well behind most states in the amount of money put toward making sure our youngest are ready to learn once they reach school age. What is your view on this, and how do you prioritize early childhood education? Rex Lawhorn.
Again, this is something that we talked about earlier when we were talking about getting kids before they get into the pipeline. The pre-education, that age from 3 to 5, when these kids are first learning in their interactions with society, and they're start getting the roots for the base of their core education, those are the times that we have to catch any of the issues that are coming up, and those are also the times when we have to encourage them and start coaxing them in the direction of their proclivities and their talents. And this also goes back to the fact that we are spending all of our money to administer these schools. You know, we have schools that have a superintendent that have less than 1,000 students. The ideal range is from 2,000 to 4,000 students in a school district for a superintendent to be able to efficiently manage them. If we had that, we would have 99 superintendents, not 537 or 527. That puts $200 million directly back into our K through 12 system. $200 million that goes to young education. It gives them school books. That gives them introductions to technologies. It gives them several other things. So we need to start spending the money correctly, but yes, we need to focus on early education.
Blake Stevens.
Shock, shock. We're lagging behind. We cut education down to the core. We cut it past the bone. What do you expect when you jam in those kids and you run out of desks for the kids to sit in because there's not enough room? That's where we have to change in Oklahoma. That's what I've been talking about. You got to make education number one in your state. Everything else will fall in place. So our children, when they're in 3- and 4-year-old programs, where we got them in our school at Locust Grove, that is their foundation. And so you can't cut corners. They come back and haunt you. So what we've got to do there again is make education number one and understand that you don't sacrifice everything else. You have all these other agencies, I understand, but you have to continue to push for transparency, external audits, unbiased, so that we can find the money. Because see, I don't think it's that we have to raise taxes necessarily, it's that we got to find where the money's going. Thank you.
Dan Fisher.
Let me reiterate that our legislature just passed the largest annual budget in the history of our state, and 60% of that is going to education. So you need to let that sink in. I believe in education, but I am concerned. We already have kids for 12 years, 1st through 12th grade. How early do we want to surrender them to public school? I believe there is a role for parents, and I'm a little bit concerned that we keep wanting to move the age back even earlier and earlier. Parental rights are very important to me. I believe the best education will come from responsible parents. So we're spending 60% of our budget already. We have them for 12 years. I suggest that we fix what we have, and I think would be amazed at what would happen.
Joe Exotic.
You can't invest in a quarter horse that can't run a race. It doesn't matter how much money we throw at it and how young you want to start. The part of Oklahoma that I'm from and the part of Oklahoma that I travel around, and I do a lot of traveling, they use pre-K more as a babysitting service than they do anything. Nothing is taught from the parents because the parents can't even hold down a job. So again, it goes back to the self-respect. We've got to get the teenagers that are having babies right now under control. Whether we got to teach something about birth control, or we got to get some standards brought back up to the people that are putting these little kids inside that system. I may lose a few votes off of this one, but it's the damn truth. They drop them off at our zoo and we can babysit them because they're too little to go to school. We got to get to the problem, folks, and it's not the funding. It's the drugs, the alcohol, and we got to teach the parents how to teach their own kids something.
Christopher Barnett.
We did just pass the largest tax bill ever for education, but it's just a Band-Aid. It's a short-term solution to a long-term problem. Next year, we're gonna have to do it again. There is no long-term funding on it. It was very short-term. We need to fully fund education, even pre-K, all the way through, and we need to make sure that the funds for education are not misappropriated, that it's not touched. 100% for education, and no legislature or anyone can touch those funds or move them anywhere else. That's what we need to do.
Gary Jones.
My wife taught kindergarten for 30 years. Her niece teaches kindergarten. My daughter teaches pre-K, and we have 2 nieces that teach pre-K. And I can tell you, I was in Stillwater a week after the walkout, and one of the teachers' niece said, "Gary, it's Uncle Gary, we appreciate the raise, but we need to reduce class sizes. We need to have better supplies. We need to have teachers' aides." Those are the things that have been done away with because we removed the rules that 1017 put in place. So what we need to do is we need to work with educators. We have a big problem at 23rd and Lincoln is that people at 23rd and Lincoln want to tell everybody how to do everything. What we need is a governor that's willing to sit down and work with educators to find the solution to these problems and make sure we have the right level of funding. It shouldn't be a percentage, it should be what's necessary to fund it, and if it's our #1 priority, we should fund it first before we move on to something else, and that's what I'll do.
Chris Powell.
Education and the idea that we need to move authority and responsibility back down to the local level that's been the main thing, the biggest thing I've been talking about since I started running in this race. And this is part of the reason. We have a situation now where if a parent goes to the educational institution and says, I have this problem with my child that needs to be addressed, a lot of times the answer from the teacher is, this is the way that we have to do it. These are the rules that we're given. If we want our parents to be involved, and a lot of teachers will tell you that most parents aren't, we've got to give them somebody they can talk to that can actually do something, and we've got to make that somebody the teacher in the classroom. And we need to apply that to early education as well, so that parents and teachers and educators in those programs will be partners instead of just going along with the program passed by the 150 member state super school board at the Capitol.
Drew Edmondson.
The concept of pre-K got its impetus from the Kaiser Family Foundation, which started it with private funding. And then under the administration, I believe, of Governor Brett Henry, we passed statutes saying that schools had to offer it. The decision on whether to participate is still up to the parents, but the school has to offer the system. We then proceeded over the last 8 years to try to starve it to death, and that has to be reversed. We did pass a good chunk of change in the last session of the legislature, about $400 million. But keep in mind, it was about half of what was being asked for that was needed for education and other needs of state government. And also keep in mind that half of that, the gasoline tax and the tobacco tax, is only good for the first year. The second year, gasoline goes to transportation and tobacco goes to health. So the next governor is going to have to start filling that hole to get back to ground zero on education. That's my commitment. We'll get it done.
And that concludes the question and answer portion of the FOI Oklahoma 2018 gubernatorial debate with gubernatorial candidates Gary Jones, Chris Powell, Drew Edmondson, Rex Lawhorn, Blake Cowboy Stevens, Dan Fisher, Joe Exotic, and Christopher Barnett. Thank you, gentlemen, for participating. And now, once again, FOI Oklahoma President Joe Wertz.
Thank you so much, everybody.